Hey, welcome to Bethel Online. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're watching us today, it's by no accident. We believe that God has something just for you. Here at Bethel, we believe that when real people like you and me, encounter the real Jesus, real change happens. So our hope and prayer for you is that you have an encounter with Jesus today. We also believe that God has a next step for all of us to take. Today, your step may just be watching this week's message. It could be asking God to forgive you and finally putting your hope and trust and faith in Jesus for the first time. Maybe it's being baptized or beginning to read through the Bible, whatever it is. We want to help you take that next step. You can let us know what step you're taking by texting the word online to 765-433-2004. We would love to walk with you. During this season, God is teaching us to be flexible. It seems like every week there's a new challenge and more changes. A great way to stay up to date on all the changes that's happening at Bethel is to follow us on social media. It's also a great way to listen to current and past Sunday morning messages. Like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Instagram. You can find us on all these platforms by searching Bethel Putco. Well, thanks again for tuning in online today. We want you to know that you are wanted, you are welcomed here, and that you are loved. I hope you have a great day. God bless.
Good morning and welcome to Bethel. We're so glad you joined us this morning. We're beginning a series called Fire and Rain. Have you ever gone through a dry season? Just a season where things just went wrong. Things just seemed to not turn around. I mean, we all know in our head that there will be times when things don't go right, but we often begin a dry season by thinking, wow, it's just not rained in a while. We've just not experienced something good for a minute. And then after this happens to us over and over and over again, we begin to think thoughts like, is it gonna rain again? Is it gonna get better? Am I gonna feel joy again after just a real tough season? A dry season can be discouraging. One time when I was raising cattle, I was so excited for a crop of calves out of some young cows that I had. And I was already counting my calves before they were born, even though I'd been taught not to count your chicks before they hatch. And I was so excited, and I thought this was going to be a great calving season. And the first cow went to have her calf, and she had the worst reaction ever. She had the calf. She looked at it, and then she ran to the other end of the pasture. For days, I tried to get her to take the baby. She never would, and it didn't work out. And then the next two calves were born on a really cold day outside, and they got too cold, and they didn't make it. And I all of a sudden was like, am I ever going to have success at this? I've put in the work. I've put in the effort. I put in all of these safeguards, and all of these things are happening. Is it ever going to turn around? And I began to lose hope. As a matter of fact, there were days where I thought, I should just sell all of these cattle. I should just move on from this. Nothing good's going to come out of this. And when we go through a dry season, the same thing can happen. Today, we're going to talk about a guy named Elijah. And Elijah spent part of his time that Scripture talks about in a dry season. I mean, literally, he spent part of his time in a drought. The season we're going to talk about today is a dry season, but he also was operating and serving God during a season that was dry for God's people. As a matter of fact, most of the people of God, most of them, had actually turned their back on God and began worshiping other gods. God does some of his best work in the dry seasons, but it's often hard to recognize what he's doing. You see, in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 24, Elijah tells King Ahab, the king that is leading the people, that the people have turned away from God, and he says, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve. That's a little bit of a dig to Ahab there. I'm not serving you, and I'm not serving the Baals that everyone else is. I'm actually following God. And he says, there will be no dew nor rain for the next few years except at my word. Now, Elijah is being a part of the work of God. He's declaring what God has told him to tell the king, except the problem with there being a famine in a land as a result of what God is doing is that even if you're following God, sometimes you can experience the famine at hand. And so Elijah tells the king Ahab, he says, it's going to be dry until I say. But he's going to be living in the middle of a dry season. And I'm sure maybe in this moment, having heard from God, he's feeling some confidence. But I'm sure along the way, there were moments in which he wrestled with, is it going to rain again? Like, is this going to get better? Are the people going to turn around? Israel had turned their backs on God and worshiping the Baals. And here's something that we see throughout Scripture from the beginning till now, and it might make a legitimate question for us to ask ourselves. What do we worship? I mean, we prioritize what we worship. If you want to ask the question of what your life worships, where do your resources and your time and effort go? Where does your parenting energy go to? What are you investing into your kids? It might reflect what you worship. And in this day and age, they were worshiping these Baals. Baal was known as the god of rain, but he was often represented as holding a lightning bolt. That Baal was who these people were relying on for rain. And God was going to show them that the Baals were not in control. So he tells them that it won't rain. He's telling them, if you don't stop your disobedience, I'll cripple everything. The culture where they were at was an agricultural culture. This is what they relied on. Rain handled their whole economy. If you want to get people's attention, impact the economy. And God is going to get their opinion. He says, if you don't stop your disobedience, I'll cripple everything. Something that we often say here at Bethel is that everyone has a next step. Whether you're 5 or 105, you have a next step. So here Elijah is, and he's declaring this to King Ahab. Now, I believe God had a next step for King Ahab. I believe God had a next step for his people who had turned their back. I believe that God had a next step for Elijah. Elijah took his step and he told the king that they were about to enter a dry season because of their sin. Everyone has a next step. What's yours? Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Of course, Elijah has to leave because he's just delivered news, bad news to the king. And kings don't like when you deliver bad news. And he's actually even kind of called the king out. It says, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Elijah's job was to share the word of God with God's people. And even though very few people were listening during this time period, throughout history and throughout time, there have been people who obediently sought to take their next step as they followed Jesus. The word of the Lord came to Elijah and told him, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. See, in Elijah's world, there's a problem with this phrase. Well, number one, how many of you would like to eat after birds? The problem was ravens were known as a dirty bird. We all know the Ravens don't make the playoffs, but they all were very aware that ravens were a dirty bird. They were a street bird. They were a bird that cleaned up and picked up, and you wouldn't eat after a raven. The ravens were supposed to eat after you. They were unclean. I find it interesting that God sends Elijah in the middle of a dry season to an unclean place to be fed by unclean birds. Don't ever doubt that God cannot use the things that are unclean of this world to do his work. Even in the dry season, God will speak to us. Here Elijah is, he's entered into this time of drought, and he is going to have some issues in a drought with where he gets his water, and God sends him to a place where there will be water. God uses an unclean place and an unclean bird to make sure to take care of his servant Elijah. A phrase I heard a few years ago that I have kept in my head for a long time is this phrase that God is fully responsible for those who are fully devoted to him. Where does your devotion lie? That you can be confident if your devotion is in God, that God is fully responsible for taking care of you. God will often call us to actions. He called him to go to the brook, and he called him to be there near the Kerith Brook so that God could take care of his needs. He took the next step, and God provided in the dry season. And I believe for those of us who may be in the middle of a tough season, but we may be in a tough spiritual season, we can also know that even though it seems like maybe it's a dry season, God still wants to speak to us in a powerful way. And God provides for Elijah by sending the ravens and giving him the brook. So he did what the Lord had told him, Scripture says. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 5, it tells us that he did what the Lord had told him. I think so often when we're in a dry season, our question is, what do you want me to do, God? And so often, one of the reasons we get to a dry season is because we haven't done what God told us to do last. You see, God had told the people of Israel, God had told the people to not have any other gods over him. This theme isn't just a one-time theme. It's a theme throughout the entire relationship of God with his people. It still reverberates through the Old Testament and the New Testament. Have no other gods before me. If you've never heard it and you're a Christ follower, let me tell you, God does not want to be second to anything. And he tells Elijah to go to the ravine. It says, so Elijah actually did what the Lord had told him. That's the difference in following Jesus and not. It's one thing to claim that you speak in the name of God or that you live in the name of God. It's another to obey him. He went to the Kerith Ravine east of the Jordan, and he stayed there. You think he was waiting for his next step? He was doing what God told him last until God told him to do what was next. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. God took care of his needs. He not only offers to care for our needs, but he calls us to his place of provision. See, Elijah just kept taking his next step. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Now, Elijah shouldn't have been surprised by this, right? Because he had told everyone there would be a famine. And it's easy when you see things going the way you thought they would go. But after a minute, Elijah sees where God's been providing for him, and he's continued to impact the land with a dry season. And I wonder if maybe Elijah thought, well, here, I've got it made. I just stay here and I just do this. But then something happens. Elijah goes through a dry season. I believe too often we teach in the faith world that if you follow Jesus, there'll never be a dry season. But actually, God often calls us into a dry season to bring a drink to the world we live in. And sometimes in order to experience God's provision for us, we have to step into a season that's dry. And here he is, near a dried up brook and no rain. You think maybe as the brook got drier and drier, he began to say, hey, you are still going to take care of me, right, God? You are still going to look out for me. You know, God, I did what you asked me to do, and now I'm experiencing a dry season. And then he ran out of water. And I wonder if maybe there was a point where he started to panic and he's like, God, what are you doing here? God, did you forget about me? How did this happen? I did what you said, and now I'm in the middle of a dry season. But sometimes God will let us run out so that we learn He is our source. God could have continued to allow that brook to flow with water. He could have provided water there, but there wasn't just one step for Elijah. For so many people following Jesus today, I believe they believe there was one step, and it was stepping into a relationship with Him. But God doesn't just keep us where we are. He takes us to a better place. He allows us and offers us real change. And so many times we can miss out when we don't recognize that God doesn't just give us one step. We all have a next step. And the answer to finding the next step is staying in contact with the one who knows the right direction. In this moment, Elijah runs out so he can learn that God is his source. It says, then the word of the Lord came to him. Notice, every time in the dry season, God continues to speak to Elijah. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Many have said that the worship of Baal might have originated in Zarephath, that this woman would have been considered to be unclean by any Jewish male in his culture. That she would have definitely been considered not someone who God would have used. And yet, while she is not following God, God is using her to provide for Elijah. God has directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he was in an unclean place where Baal worship originated, in an unclean situation, but he took his next step. Don't ever doubt that God can use what is unclean. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? Now you have to understand here, this woman is not following Jesus. He's asking her for something that is a valuable commodity in her life. She's being called to a step. As she was going to get it, he called and said, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. These were not a small ask. This was a big ask. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. They were legit starving to death. And Elijah comes as a voice from God and calls her to give generously to him what she has of great value. Elijah says, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on this land. What was God offering to her was provision, that if she would devote what was important to her to him, that God would come through. She went away. And she did as Elijah had told her. I believe some of you watching here, you've not fully committed your life to Jesus. But I believe even you have a next step when it comes to a relationship with him. Maybe you continue to hear about the teachings of God and the work of God. Maybe you continue to listen, to watch. Maybe you begin to talk to God and converse with God and ask God, what is my purpose? Why am I here? Why does it matter? And you will experience, as you take your next step of obedience, you'll experience God in a fresh and life-giving way. She went away as Elijah had told her, so there was food every day for Elijah the woman and her family. Now this is a breakthrough and a miracle, and we would say it's a miracle in the dry season. And I really believe God does miracles in the dry season, but you're kind of hoping that things are looking up and it's going to all get better, and the drought is going to go away and the community is going to thrive again, but something's about to happen. And the jar of flour wasn't used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. It's interesting. Elijah had come there because he had run out of something he needed. And the woman came there because she was running out, and they met up because they had run out. Isn't it interesting how sometimes God will bring you out of a situation and bring you in contact with someone else in the situation so that you can use what you've learned about the provision of God. You see, Elijah had learned about the provision of God by the Kerith Brook, and now he was able to show this woman the provision of God in the jar in her house. So often the provision is in our house. It's a good reminder that whatever you're going through won't be wasted. That whatever pain you're dealing with, God can use for good. And I believe Elijah and this woman came in contact because Elijah could bring her the knowledge of God's provision that she drastically needed. Often the vessel for the miracle is in your house if you're willing to put God first. Notice in the story, there was always enough. 1 Kings chapter 17 goes on in verse 17 and says, sometime later. You kind of hope things got better, but sometime later, the woman who owned the house became ill. Her son, the son of the woman who owned the house, became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. It just kept getting worse. She found out that God provided, but now something even more valuable to her identity. In the culture, the son would have given her some identity within that culture. And she loses her son and he dies. Oh, it was nice to know that God provides during the dry season, but how does God provide for this horrible circumstance? The dry spell doesn't end soon enough. Something happens and he dies. And she comes to Elijah, and I think that she's really struggling. Elijah is the voice of God in her world, the presence of God in her midst, and yet she's kind of mad. Even though she's seen God kind of provide, she gets to a place of lacking understanding and she begins to get mad. And she says, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? I've devoted what I had that was valuable to me to you, and now I'm back in a dry season. Did you really just come here to point out that my people worship the Baals? Did you really come back just to punish me and guilt me?" She's in a broken place saying broken things. By the way, I think God can handle your questions. And Elijah looks to her and says, "Give me your son." Now here's the thing. She had learned to hand over to the servant of God the bread and the water. But what God was asking her to hand over here was something that had been of great value to her. And something that she wasn't sure God had valued because it had died. He was already dead. She had to have thought, what good does it do to hand him over to you now? He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. What Elijah does here would have been considered so ceremonially unclean. To put a dead body on a live person's bed. And I've wrestled with, why does he do this? As a servant of God, I believe that Elijah was showing in unclean place in an unclean situation with an unclean dead body, that he wasn't afraid to get in the middle of what was unclean and interfere. I think so many of us feel like we have to clean up before we come to God, before we clean up and come to our mess. And God is not afraid to take our mess in his arms and do something with it. It says, then he cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, I have brought you tragedy. Have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? Now it's interesting. I don't think that Elijah thought this was a part of God's plan. I think Elijah thought things would turn around, and he had experienced enough tragedy for now. He had experienced enough of the dry season, but here he is again in another hard situation after the dry season. The dry season isn't over, and he walks through another difficult spot. I think God, that he thought this woman was seeing God in him. And yet, here he is, holding what seemed to be dead, asking God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow that I'm staying with by causing her son to die? You think maybe Elijah had grown to care about this woman and her son. They had become a source for him. That maybe Elijah was questioning if God loved them as much as he loved them. Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him. What he was saying was, give me that thing you thought was dead. For some of you, you got a thing in your history, a thing in your past. You're in the middle of a season and you don't think God has any care about where you're at and what you're doing. You've lost hope. I mean, at first you thought, it'll get better. At first you thought, things will turn up. But after dry day after dry day after dry day, you begin to think that maybe God didn't know where you were at. And you begin to think maybe God didn't care about your situation, or that God had forgotten about you. But in this moment where it really appears to this woman that there's been an abandonment or there's been a punishment, that Elijah even seems to feel as if God has brought this tragedy. God takes, through Elijah, what it seemed had already died. What do you have in your hands that you think is already dead? What are you giving up hope on? What he was saying was, give me that thing you already buried. You put away. You just assume God's done with that. God doesn't want anything to do with that, and he abandoned me there. But God uses unclean birds, unclean places, and unclean bodies, unclean things to teach his servants a lesson and to change the world. God is not afraid to take everything unclean about you in his arms. And maybe the question isn't so much, why is this happening? Or why did this happen? Maybe the question is, God, what are you up to? The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house, and he gave him to his mother and said, look, your son is alive. Then the woman said to Elijah, now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is truth. And this is really important. You know why? Because there's going to be a story in a chapter just down the road where Elijah is going to go into the greatest battle of his life. He's been in a dry season. He's been in a difficult season, and he's going to walk into one that is staring him in the face with a boldness that would instill fear in nearly everyone. And Elijah's going to walk into a situation where he's never needed a miracle more. And in this moment, he's gaining some encouragement from this woman. In the moment where he questions what God's doing in him, this woman doesn't seem to. And I believe that what happened here is God was showing Elijah what he would need in a really dry day, in a really dry place, in front of all the prophets of Baal, when God decides to show that he is Elijah's God and that he is the only God. So often we have to go through the dry season. It's where we learn that God is enough. Elijah's name actually means the Lord is my God. Elijah was going to need to know that when he stood in front of all the Baals and the priests here in a few weeks. He was going to need to know who his God was. He was going to need to know him really well. He was going to need to have an incredible amount of confidence. And I believe while he was in the dry season, God was instilling confidence in who he was in Elijah, so that when he stood in his greatest moment, when he stood in the moment where he needed God most, that he would stand strong, he would speak firmly and move forward by taking his next step. What's your next step? I realize when you're in a dry season, we can build up all these emotions and thoughts when it comes to God. And really, maybe what needs to happen the most for us is when we've lost hope and we've given up hope and we've decided that we're not going to put all of our hope in God, that God is often trying to teach us exactly that we have to put our hope in Him by surrendering our own will for His and trusting in His goodness. Now, come on. Elijah had some moments in here where he probably wondered if God was really going to be good for him. The woman who barely knew God, but knew the provision of God, she had to have had moments where she was like, is God really good? You're not bad when you have those thoughts wondering about God. You're just human. And as humans, we try to understand what we can't always understand. And I'm not judging you for it, but I can tell you that sometimes the answer is beginning to surrender to taking our next step in the middle of our dry season. And maybe for you, that means praying about a thing you stopped talking to God about a long time ago. Maybe that means starting to have hope again, that maybe this isn't all there is. To get up and to go to work and to come home and go to bed and get up and go to work and come home and go to bed. That maybe God has put a purpose on your life. And maybe God's purpose, much like Elijah, maybe God's purpose for you is to carry His word to a world who's also living in a dry season. And maybe God's just reaching out to you with provision in this moment because you don't know Him. And He wants you to understand His goodness. Will you surrender to that? Surrender's really hard. It needs to stop the war, to stop the battle, to submit fully. For some of you, you know your next step and you haven't taken it. For some of you, you haven't done what God told you last, and so you need to do what God told you last and wait until God tells you what to do next. Because God is wholly, fully responsible for those who are wholly and fully devoted to Him. What do you need to surrender this morning? Can you say in your prayer this morning, God, I surrender everything to you? I love you, Bethel. Have a great week.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Are you ready to take your next step? We would love to hear from you. You can send an email to hello@bethel.us. You can send us a message on Facebook, or you can let us know in the Bethel app. And speaking of the Bethel app, take a moment, if you haven't already, to go to your app store and search Bethel Putco to download our app. There's all kinds of great resources in the app. You can listen to messages, you can view the messages from Sunday morning, and you can also fill out a digital Connect card. You can do that today and each week to let us know that you're tuning in. You can also find some great information about our Bethel Kids Ministry and our Be The One student ministries. Also in the app, you can give. It's one of 3 ways you can give: with online giving at bethel.us/give, in our app, Bethel Putco, or through text. Hey, thanks again for joining us. We hope you have a great day and know that you are loved.